The Ronald Evangelistic Association is pleased to present Wes White with Turn the Page, featuring Ron Dart.
How was Jesus perceived by the people of his time, and how did he see himself? Today, when it comes to politics, people have all kinds of differing views when it comes to what Jesus taught when he walked this earth as a mortal man. Liberals point to his sympathy toward the poor. Conservatives point to his unfailing morality. It seems as though no matter where a Christian stands on the political spectrum, he tries to back up his partisan leanings with the teachings of Jesus. Now let's join Ronald L. Dart as we turn the page back to 1979 and a sermon entitled, Was Jesus a Liberal or a Conservative?
Today I thought I'd talk to you about something that I've kind of been fascinated with for a long time. I've always found it an interesting thing in conversations with people to hear people refer to a third party as either being liberal or conservative. And I've scratched my head over it from time to time, wondering just exactly what it was that helped them to decide whether a given individual was liberal or conservative. And if you sometimes ask somebody the question, what do you mean? They're a little bit hard put to tell you what it means, because there are so many different aspects of liberalism and conservatism that you could look at that it's hard for a person to know for sure what they're talking about. For example, I know some people who are quite conservative in their personal life, who seem to be, on the other hand, quite liberal where some doctrines are concerned, but then again, you can find them quite conservative where other doctrines are concerned, and you have to almost step around and say, well, a person is liberal here or conservative there. But even there, it depends on whether you really know what you're talking about when you say liberal or conservative. Now, interestingly enough, in the churches, the various Christian churches that dot the landscape, the liberal-conservative controversy has gone on for hundreds of years. In fact, I suspect it has gone on since the first century. As the church began to spread and as the church began to grow, even within the Church of God there became liberal and conservative dichotomies. And then, of course, in the process of time, as other churches apostatized from the true Church of God and began to develop and grow, they also had their liberal-conservative splits and arguments and bickerings. It's difficult sometimes to realize, because you look at great monolithic churches like the Roman Catholic Church with the papacy and the iron control it would seem the papacy has over that church, and it's difficult to realize the deep divisions that exist within the Roman Catholic Church between liberal and conservative elements of the clergy. There are a number of them who are revisionists, who want to go back to past ways of doing things, who feel that the church is modernized much too much. There are others who want to change, who wanted to change the Mass to English and have pushed for it, and these were, I suppose, called liberal theologians. There are those who wish to see the doctrine on birth control changed in the Catholic Church as they come into the modern world, and these are labeled liberals among the Roman Catholic priesthood, among the cardinals, or those who might feel that way about it. Of course, the College of Cardinals is predominantly quite a conservative group of men, and it's only natural that it should be so, because they represent the establishment, and they are appointed by the Pope, who has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And so consequently, you have, in some of the educational institutions, some priests who are a bit radical, who do want to change certain things, who write books and eventually are severely reprimanded by the papacy or by their bishop or perhaps by their cardinal for having done so. But it's existed and had its effect on all churches. There was a very major division in the Lutheran Church not long ago because of certain very conservative elements in the Lutheran Church who were resenting some of the things that were being taught at, I believe, Concordia Lutheran College. And so it goes. Even the Baptists have their liberal and conservative elements. Some of them even drink, as a matter of fact. And others of them believe that, of course, it is quite wrong to do so. And I suppose the ones that drink would be called liberal, and the ones that fight against it would be called conservative, even among the Baptists. Interestingly enough, even in the Church of God, and I suppose that comes as no surprise, we have had our liberal and conservative elements over the years. It's always been fun to observe some of the name-calling that goes on. I remember not long ago, I was labeled by somebody, I forget exactly who it was at the time, an arch-conservative. And I was particularly amused by it because I knew several areas where this gentleman was much more conservative than I, where I was recommending change, where he was recommending no change, and it was kind of funny. But nevertheless, the label could be hung. I remember one gentleman I talked to, a minister, who had been included on some committee that was discussing some doctrinal element, and he said he was quite sure that he had been included on the committee to represent the liberal communist pinko element, as he rather sarcastically put it, in the theological spectrum of the Church of God. It would seem to be sometimes almost funny if it weren't such a serious matter that we have this kind of a division, it would say, in the Church of God. It's a very real one. It's a division, everybody sees quite clearly the division between the Worldwide Church of God, the Church of God International, and the Seventh-day Church of God. What they may not be quite so aware of is the very serious division that still exists in the Worldwide Church of God among liberal and conservative elements, a division which will always exist. You may recall recently there was some big articles going on and conversation about a purge of liberal elements from the Worldwide Church of God. And I read the article, and I found myself amused despite myself, because I had to realize that if you have this broad spectrum of the ministry, which is divided along liberal and conservative lines, you have to realize that there is no open middle ground in the middle where there is no one. They are strung out along a continuum there. And somewhere someone has to work his way back among these liberals and cut off the most liberal group and thereby purge the liberal element from the Church of God. What amused me was the fact that whoever was thinking in those terms didn't realize that as soon as these men were gone, to the observer he would then begin to see the remaining ministry in a similar liberal conservative spectrum, and they would have to look at it again and say, now we have still got a liberal element in the ministry, because human beings are not the same. Now, what is fascinating is most human beings tend to perceive themselves as being middle-of-the-road type of people. Isn't that the way you see yourself? That basically you don't think you're a strong liberal or a strong conservative. You think of yourself as being essentially middle of the road. And you see other people in relation to yourself. And, if you look around trying to find a standard or a benchmark, something independent you can point out and say, now, by this standard, this person is a liberal and this person is a conservative. I never hear anybody refer to a standard in those kinds of conversations. I have never heard anybody say, by this standard or that standard or the other standard, I judge this person to be a liberal or conservative. They simply say he is liberal or he is conservative, and obviously what they mean is he is either left or he is right of me, because I am, for the most part, a middle-of-the-road person. Now, maybe in some wild flash of honesty somewhere along the line, we will admit to ourselves that we are a little to the right of center or a little to the left of center. But it's a very rare person who sees himself as being well out on one wing or the other and is proud of it. Now, I do know a few people like that, interestingly enough, and I think most of them that I have known in that regard have been, it's rather fascinating. I have known a few conservative-type people who consider themselves conservatives, extremely conservative, and quite proud of it, and who believed that that was the standard of right, and that everything, including middle-of-the-roaders, were considered as being slightly pinko. Pinko being just short of being red, which is very far left or very far on the liberal side of the spectrum. And maybe I should explain the vocabulary before I get too deeply into this sermon. I've known a few people who thought themselves or were quite proud of the fact that they were liberal. Now, what was interesting to me, and I remember sitting and discussing this with a young man one day who thought himself quite liberal in the ministry, and we were discussing along the way. I said, what is a liberal? We grabbed the dictionary down off the shelf and we read what it was. And one of the things it mentioned about a liberal was that the true liberal, was tolerant. And I pointed out to him that another gentleman or two we'd been discussing who considered themselves liberals were extremely intolerant of conservatives. Therefore, could they really call themselves liberal? And the answer is no. And so, there is a certain futility in all of the labeling that goes on. You put on your badge, or you put a badge on someone else. I'm middle of the road, he's to the right, he's to the left. This man's a liberal, this man's a conservative, this man's a arch-liberal, arch-conservative, dangerous, communist, pinko, leftist, whatever it is you want to call people. But the main thing that we have to be sure we establish is that we understand that whatever they are that deviates from us is not as good as we are. And that, of course, is a natural human tendency to come along. Now, here's the part, and you may be ahead of me in this regard. I've talked about it a little bit before. Even asked the question in the sermon once before. When you look into the Bible, was Jesus a liberal or a conservative? Now, I think it's a valid question to ask. If we are going to look at people and try to decide if they're liberal or conservative, I think it's valid to look at Jesus Christ, who should be some sort of a standard or a benchmark for us of what a liberal or a conservative is, and ask ourselves, Was Jesus, during the time of his earthly ministry, when we can look at the things that he did and said, was he a liberal or was he a conservative? What was his approach? Now, I brought along a dictionary with me today because, you got to know what you're talking about before you get too deeply into this type of thing. And I thought I'd read to you the definitions of liberal and conservative, starting first with conservatism, or conservatism, I should say. Again, it's a little difficult to work that one out. But conservatism, a disposition in politics to preserve what is established, a political philosophy based on tradition, social stability, stressing established institutions, and preferring gradual development to abrupt change. Now, that's fairly easy to follow there. A conservative is one who is defined as tending or disposed to maintain existing views, conditions, or institutions. He's a traditional type of person. Okay? I think you probably got that, at least have got it well enough for us to take a look at a few scriptures and see if that description matches Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Turn back to Matthew, the 15th chapter. We'll wade through a few things here and ask ourselves just how this does match up with the man that we look to as our Savior, the one who died for us, the one whose life we are supposed to pattern ourselves after. In Matthew 15 and verse 1 we read, "Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." Now remember, the conservative attitude is a traditional attitude, to maintain established traditions and ideas and doctrines, approaches and practices. And these men, these Pharisees and the scribes who were of the sect of the Pharisees themselves, otherwise called lawyers, were an extremely conservative group of people because they had an establishment. They had a group or a concept of religion that had been in existence for some long period of time now that they followed, and they wanted to know why Jesus' disciples were not following that tradition. He answered and said to them, "Why do you transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he that curses father or mother, let him die to death. But you say, Whosoever will say to his father or his mother, It is a gift whereby you may be profited by me, or Corban, and shall honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have you made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition." Now, who's the liberal and who's the conservative in this conversation? It's extremely difficult to tell, because what Christ is accusing these men of is changing an original concept. And he seems to be saying, the original is what is right, what you have introduced is what is wrong, and yet, how was he seen by the Pharisees? As a liberal. What else? How else could they have seen him? They had a tradition of their fathers, a tradition that had been around for many scores of years, one that had existed before they were born. And here came Jesus and his disciples walking roughshod all over this tradition, and they looked upon him immediately as being a liberal. And yet he turns right around and says, your tradition is transgressing the law of God. He goes on to say, "But in vain do they worship me," verse 9, "teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." And he called the multitude and said to them, "Hear and understand. Not that which goes into the mouth defiles a man, but that which comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man." Then came his disciples and said unto him, "Don't you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" And he answered and said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone." Now, the conservative is the person who would prefer gradual change. But you don't root up a plant gradually. You grab a hold of it by the base and you jerk hard and it comes out, hopefully, if you're big enough and strong enough and it's not too rooted. But the idea is you tear the thing out. Christ's concept was not one of a gradual change. It was of a revolution. It was, these individuals, they were going to be rooted up and thrown out. Now, this isn't a conservative point of view. As I said, he would have been looked upon as a liberal by the Pharisees to start with, and yet, how did he see himself? Well, it's not totally clear here. Let's go over to Mark, the 2nd chapter, to another interesting encounter. Mark chapter 2, and beginning in verse 14. "As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. And it came to pass, that as Jesus sat at meat in his house, many publicans and sinners sat also together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and the Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with these people? How can he do this thing?" How did the scribes and the Pharisees see Jesus Christ when he invited into his own home, or when he went into Levi's home and sat down and meet with these people? And there were tax collectors who were notorious cheaters. There were sinners who were there, people whose crimes or sins apparently were known to everybody. And it didn't even seem to bother Jesus on occasion when a woman who had been known as the town naughty lady came in and washed his feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Now, they saw this. They would not allow such a woman to touch them. They would not come into the presence of a person who was known as an alcoholic or a drunkard in the town. And yet Jesus sat down and ate and talked with and was apparently comfortable with such people. I would call that, I would assume many people would call that a liberal point of view, a liberal action, a liberal approach. Certainly, the Pharisees saw it that way. I was fascinated some weeks ago. It's been quite a while now. We were out to dinner in a restaurant. The wives had not come down yet, but they were going to join us there. We were sitting chatting with a friend when a gentleman sort of reeled over to our table, obviously feeling no pain whatsoever. Pulled up a chair and sat down and joined the group right there and began to talk to us. He said, "Boy, I've listened to you. I've seen you on television, and I think, you are this, that, and the other thing." And then the gentleman began to turn morose, in a way, very sad, because suddenly he realized that he had come into the presence of a preacher, and he knew he was drunk, and he knew what kind of person he was, and he felt awfully guilty, and he began to sort of tear up, not the kind of person he should be, and began to, carry on in this way. And it was kind of interesting, in the sense that some people, I suppose, and certainly a Pharisee, would have felt compelled to get up from the table, to excuse himself, to get away from this person, would refuse to talk to him and refuse to have anything to do with him at all. Jesus would have been comfortable sitting and talking to the man, and he would not have condemned him. How do I know that Jesus would not have condemned him? Well, there came an occasion when he was sitting talking and teaching, and somebody had a big noise outside and a struggle, and all of a sudden they dragged this woman, protesting and dragging her feet in the room, and shove her right in the circle in front of everybody. And they say, "Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act." Now, Moses tells us in the law that such should be stoned. What do you say? And he stooped down and wrote with his finger in the dust as though he did not even hear them. And they pressed him. And he looked up and he said, "Well, he who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone." And he stooped back down and began to write in the dirt again. They, beginning at the eldest, I think one ancient manuscript says, began to leave. And I think it's significant that somebody thought the oldest people, the older men, left first. But they all walked out and left them alone, and here sat Jesus, writing on the ground, the woman standing there alone. And he looked up and looked around and he said, "What happened to your accusers? Has no man condemned you?" She said, "No man, Lord." And he said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." It's a funny thing about Jesus. He never seemed to be uncomfortable in the presence of a known sinner. Now, why do you suppose that was? Is that a liberal characteristic, or is that a conservative characteristic? The Pharisees obviously thought it was rather liberal. They were conservative. They were the ones who would preserve the status quo. They were the ones who would not be touched by a sinner. They were the ones who would not eat with a Gentile. They were going to maintain their way, their righteousness, their approach. It's fascinating. Jesus answered to them when he heard their complaining about him eating with these people. He said, "They that are whole have no need of a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." We invited that chap who came by the table to come by the office sometime and visit with us. He said he would, and as far as I know, he never has. The disciples of John and the Pharisees used to fast. And then the Pharisees came and asked him, "Why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples fast not?" Again, this is a dangerous liberalizing trend on Christ's part. And Jesus said to them, can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days shall come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then shall they fast in those days. No man also sews a piece of new cloth on an old garment. This particular scripture is absolutely fascinating to me, and I think maybe there is something for us to be learned, something to be learned from this for our present situation today. It is quite clear that what Jesus was doing was something new. And anything new tends to be a threat to that which is old. It's liberal. It is not conserving the old. And by that very definition, conservatism involves hanging on to what you've got. This is not a conservative statement. He says, no man sews a piece of new cloth on an old garment, else the new piece that filled it up takes away from the old, and the rent is made worse. And no man puts new wine in old bottles, else the new wine does burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles be marred. But new wine must be put in new bottles. What's he talking about? He is saying quite categorically to these people, I didn't come here to be a part of your sect, your group, because the Pharisees were not the religion of God. They were Jews, yes. They were a part of Judaism, yes. They served at the temple, yes. But not even the high priest was one of their number. They were a sect of Judaism. And Jesus says to these individuals, I did not come here to be a Pharisee or a Sadducee or an Essene. I'm not here to be a part of some sect of Judaism or even of Judaism itself. This is new wine, and it shall not be put in old bottles. He came to save publicans and sinners and to build a church made up, not of righteous people, but of sinners. Now that is not what you would call a conservative approach to religion. And he just told them plainly in this situation, we are not going to take this new truth and try to place it inside of Judaism. That's not what I'm here for. Because frankly, the new wine and its fermentation would burst the old bottle. It would just not be able to hold it. And the Pharisees came and said unto him, behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And here we go again. And he said to them, have you not ever read what David did when he had need and was hungry, and those that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread which it is not lawful to eat, but for the priests, and gave to them that were with him? What's he trying to say? He is saying that David and his men, along with Abiathar the priest, made an exception to the law of God and were not condemned for it because of the necessity of the circumstance they were in. Now that is hardly a conservative approach to doctrine, is it? Because the conservative approach is no exceptions. You don't tamper with this thing. You don't mess around with it. Now that doesn't do away with the law. It doesn't mean it's all right to do that any time and every time. All Jesus is saying is that there are times when human life may very well transcend certain aspects of the law of God. Or, putting it another way, some aspects of the law of God may override other aspects of the law of God. For as he put it on one occasion, he says, is it lawful to save life or to take it? And his point seems to be that you're fulfilling the law of God in the process of saving life. These men, whom Jesus labeled as hypocrites, would not so much as lift a finger to help a sick person on the Sabbath, but they would loose one of their animals and lead it off and give it drink. They would help an ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath day, and then they would dare to accuse him for healing the sick on the Sabbath day. He understood them. He understood them quite well. And he felt that and he said quite categorically, their doctrines and their approach and their conservatism was so much hypocrisy before God. He said, and he went on to say, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. It's kind of interesting when you look at it and you begin to try to ask yourself some questions. I think we get involved in tossing terms around very loosely, when we talk about people as being liberal or conservative, or ourselves as being liberal or conservative. I think it's far more important for us to understand what was Jesus Christ, and just how closely do we match up to the standard that he set and the approach that he wanted us to follow. In Matthew 11, and beginning in verse 1, it came to pass, when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, Are you he that should come, or should we look for somebody else? Jesus answered and said, I want you to go and show John again those things which you do hear and see. Why did he have to be shown again? And Christ emphasizes, it seems, the again. It seems to imply that John had seen it before, and yet for some reason he was troubled. Something was bothering him. Something was tugging away at it. And we've looked at it, we've pondered over it, and put the scriptures together and begun to realize that some feel, that John was somewhat disturbed by Jesus' lifestyle. You get a little bit of a hint of it as we go along, but Jesus' answer was, don't go back and show John my lifestyle or anything of the sort. He says, go back and tell him what you hear and what you see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he, whoever he shall be, who is not offended in me. The implication is, from Jesus, that John had become somewhat offended and needed reassurance, and he sent that reassurance back to them. As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken in the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? He says, those who are in soft raiment are in kings' houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Oh, more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I will send my messenger before your face, which shall prepare your way before you. Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there has not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. He goes on down talking about a little bit more in verse 16. He says, Whereunto shall I liken this generation? It's like children sitting in the markets and calling to their fellows, and saying, We have piped to you, and you have not danced. We have mourned unto you, and you have not lamented. Well, what does he mean? He comes right down to it in the next verse. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, He has a devil. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, Behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. But wisdom is justified of her children. What is he saying by that? Well, just simply, you can tell who's who by the results. But what is fascinating in this whole thing is he just makes it very clear to these people. There is no way it seems to please you. It is no way that this can be done in a way that you will like. John came with a very conservative lifestyle. He came neither eating nor drinking. He was very abstemious. On the other hand, the Son of Man came with a very liberal lifestyle. He ate, he drank, he was clothed well. And on the one hand, you say the man has a demon, on the other hand, you say the man has a glutton. What does it take to please you people? And the fact of the matter is, they saw themselves as middle of the road, and they saw everyone else in relation to themselves, either right or left or wrong in some way. And that's the way Jesus looked back at them. But as I say, even in this particular thing, does Jesus cast himself as a conservative? Well, no, he really doesn't, does he? And yet, when you come back down to it again, you say, well, what was he really? Turn back to Luke, the 7th chapter. Luke chapter 7 and verse 36. One of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, anointed them with ointment. The Pharisee who had bidden him saw it, and he said to himself, saying, If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she is a sinner. Again, showing the attitude of a Pharisee, who would, I suppose, be labeled an arch-conservative, in relation to this woman. He then comes back and gives this man the parable of the man who had 2 creditors, 2 people that owed him money, 2 debtors, I mean. One of them owed him 500, the other 50, and he forgave both of them. Which one of them loves him the most, do you suppose? And his answer was, I suppose him to whom he has forgiven the most. And Jesus then draws this beautiful statement about he who has been forgiven much, loves much. He who has been forgiven little, loves little. And his whole approach is one of a complete and total forgiveness and an attitude of forgiveness. But how was he looked at by the Pharisee? As a liberal, and as a dangerous liberal at that. But you still have to answer this question about liberal. We didn't read the definition of liberal a while ago. Just what do you mean, liberal? Well, the adjective means essentially broad-minded, tolerant, not bound by authoritarianism, orthodoxy, or traditional forms. That's kind of an interesting way of putting it. Not bound by authoritarianism, orthodoxy, or traditional forms. In some ways that would seem to fit Jesus. A liberal as a noun is one who is liberal, one who is open-minded in the observance of orthodox or traditional forms. Liberalism, on the other hand, is called a movement, the quality or state of being liberal, a movement in modern Protestantism emphasizing intellectual liberty, the spiritual and ethical content of Christianity. A theory in economics emphasizing individual freedom from restraint and usually based upon free competition, the self-regulating market, the gold standard. It's a political philosophy based on belief in progress, the essential goodness of man, and the autonomy of the individual, and standing for the protection of political and civil liberties. Now, it's kind of hard in that to find anything that exactly would fit the religious spectrum, because they look at it more economically and politically in a lot of ways. But I think it might be worth taking a moment just to see what indications there might be, even from our traditional feeling about liberal conservative, as to what Jesus' approach was. Turn back to John, the 2nd chapter, and verse 13. And the Jews' Passover was at hand. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said to them that sold doves, Take these things out of here. Make not my Father's house a man of merchandise. His disciples remembered it was written, The zeal of your house has eaten me up. Now, is this the action of a liberal? A person who is tolerant? Well, no, not really. One of the things it mentioned was free enterprise, the willingness to let, a laissez-faire attitude toward free enterprise and the buying and selling of things. A liberal would have wandered in there and say, well, I guess, we got to let people be fair about it and let people sell and let them buy. And, of course, the Pharisees had allowed this laxity to develop. And Jesus comes in and takes a hold of the reins and gives a good sharp jerk and tightens up on the worship of God in the temple. That's not the action of a liberal. At least not by the way most of us think of it. It's really quite a conservative reaction, isn't it? Interesting when you think about it that way. Turn back to the 5th chapter of Matthew, to some really basic Christianity. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. He says, I am not here to change that. I'm not here to do away with the past. I'm here to preserve the past, to fulfill the law. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Or, as the margin is, till all come to pass. That's a different word for fulfill here, by the way, from the word fulfill in the preceding verse. Fulfill in verse 17 is plerose in the Greek. Fulfill in verse 18 is genetai, and you don't have to know Greek to hear the difference between those two words. They are totally different. Plerose in verse 17 means to fill it up. Genetai means come to pass, till it all is fulfilled or comes to pass. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, is this a liberalizing concept? Because really, in many people's minds, the concept of liberalizing means watering down. Have you ever heard that expression? Have you heard that recently in any other context? For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we could have a lot of ideas about what that means, but let's let him explain what it means when he says your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, because he goes right on to explain. You have heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not kill, and whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. Now, did Jesus move to the left or to the right? He didn't move. But was it a liberal or a conservative move that he made in relation to this law? But I say unto you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council, but whoever shall say thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. I would say that was a fairly strong conservative move. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and remember your brother has anything against you, you leave your gift there and go be reconciled to your brother. Going on down, he says in verse 27, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not commit adultery. Now he's going again to make a move on this. He's going to move off of the Pharisees' position. But is he going to move to the left, or is he going to move to the right? But I say unto you, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Is he loosening the reins on the law, or is he tightening the reins on the law? As far as whether you are guilty of sin at all, is he making you more guilty or less? Well, he's making it a lot tighter. Then he goes on to say, in verse 31, it has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced, commits adultery. Now, which direction was that move? Was that a watering down? Was that an easing of the reins? Was that cutting loose the strings? Or was that tightening up on the family relationship? Seems to me that is a fairly strong conservative move. Now it goes on, and I could go on to verse 33. You have heard. It has been said of them of old time, you shall not forswear unto yourself, but you shall perform unto the Lord your oaths. Is this going to be loosened, or is this going to be tightened? But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, it's the city of the great king. Neither shall you swear by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black, but let your communication be yea, yea, or nay, nay, for whatever is more than this comes of evil. Then comes turn the other cheek. Then comes loving your enemies of all things. Previously, you had to love your neighbor, love your friends and hate your enemies. Now he says you're supposed to love your enemies. That's a pretty strong tug on the string. He goes on down in verse 47. If you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Don't even the publicans do that? Be you, therefore, perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now that's all very, very strong stuff. And you ask yourself, well, I looked at this thing the first time, and I said to myself, he doesn't seem at all conservative. In fact, this seems to be quite a liberal. And then you turn around and look at it on the other side, and no, he doesn't seem to be liberal at all. He seems to be quite conservative. And I asked the question, what was he? Was he a liberal, or was he a conservative? I think it's important for us to understand all this. Turn back to Matthew, the 22nd chapter, for just a little general feeling of the way he looked at certain things and the way he did certain things. Matthew chapter 22 and verse 23. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed to his brother. Now there were with us 7 brethren. The first, whom he had married a wife, deceased, having no issue, left his wife to his brother. The second also, and the third, and the seventh, and last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. Now here you have 2 different approaches to religion. You have the Pharisees' approach, which was a very spiritual type of a mystical approach. You have the Sadducees' approach, a much more down-to-earth type of thing. You have the Pharisees with a very, very conservative image. You have the Sadducees, on the other hand, with a much more liberal, Grecian type of an approach to things. An acceptance of the inevitable, a very physical attitude. They denied the resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees held. Now remember, the Pharisees looked upon Christ as a liberal in matters of doctrine because he seemed so far to the left of them. But the Pharisees took a look at him and says, I'm believing in the resurrection from the dead, and saw some of these last things that I showed you, and they considered him a hopeless conservative. And they were trying to trap him in some of the things that he was saying where they were concerned. Jesus answered and said unto them, You do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. When the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they got together. And one of them, who was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and trying to trap him. And so here it goes, and on this thing went. As he walked down the middle of the road, as it were, between two conflicting groups, both of whom were trying to trap him on things that he said constantly, because he was indeed a threat to both of them. In chapter 23, verse 1, Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do you not after their works, for they say and do not. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. All their works they do to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries. They enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogue. As far as any outward show of religion, it was all there. Any kind of a badge or an emblem, anything they could sew onto their clothes, anything like a blue ribbon at the bottom, a phylactery they could wrap around their head or their arm to show that they were in some way righteous. That was all there. But as far as what they would actually do with their life, that was a different matter. And again, we find another strange breakdown in this concept of liberal conservative. We have those who are quite conservative in what they say and quite liberal in what they do. And that gets kind of interesting as well. And they love the uppermost rooms at feasts, the chief seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Don't you be called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all your brethren. Call no man your father upon earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be you called master, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you, let him be your servant. Whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased. He that shall humble himself shall be exalted. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut up heaven against men. You don't go in yourself, and you don't allow anybody else to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore you shall receive the greater damnation. Are these words of a liberal or a conservative? It's a little hard to tell, isn't it? Later in this chapter, in verse 23, he says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and you've omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, and not to have left the other undone. You know, you look at this thing, and you wind up feeling that the whole question of liberal or conservative is so hopelessly complex that there isn't any way of even sorting it out in the New Testament, because who was the original conservative in all this? Because what Christ seems to be doing so much of the time is saying to the Pharisees, you have made the law of God the original, pure concept of a way of life. You have perverted it by what you have done. He seems to tell them that they are the ones who liberalized, changed, distorted the law. And he himself is taking them back beyond the Pharisees to a much more pure concept, a much higher concept, a much more elevated concept. But of course what he's talking about as much as anything is the hypocrisy of those who pretend to be defenders of the law, of those who pretend to be conservative, while in actual truth they are sinners and they don't themselves do any of the things they suggest to other people. You know, there are so many ways of looking at this question that sometimes you begin to wonder if there's an answer to it. At the human level, it gets kind of interesting. Which is more conservative? Let me ask you this. A man who eats in the very finest restaurants, where some of these places, you know, that are really top-notch places, there will be a waiter at the table, at least one waiter, for every person sitting around the table. In some cases, there are even more. And there is a waiter for one course and a waiter for another course, and there's a wine waiter, and the other waiter can't even touch the wine bottle. And this person who goes into this restaurant runs his finger down the menu and finds the most expensive champagne on the menu and orders that. Now, this is on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a man who goes to a Mexican restaurant and orders a beer. Which of these two individuals would you be inclined to say was the more conservative? Then to go a step further, we have two individuals. One who rides around in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce or Cadillac, the other person who drives himself in a Chevy van or a Jeep. Which is the more liberal or which is the more conservative as far as the way you would normally look at conservation or conservatism? What about the difference between a man, let's say, who would buy the most expensive suits, tailor-made, made actually to measure with sometimes with gold thread in them and so forth, or on the other hand, a person who buys $80 to $120 suits off the rack? Which is the more conservative approach to this type of thing? Now, I think when you begin to look at these things, you sometimes wonder, well, what is conservative? What's not conservative? When you look at Jesus Christ, Jesus is neither liberal nor conservative. He is simply right. That's all. He is simply right. Human beings are neither liberal nor conservative, though they sometimes think they are. They are merely selfish. What do I mean by that? Well, if you as a human being are a part of the establishment, you will almost inevitably be conservative. Because if you're a part of the establishment, you're in the in group, you don't want change. You want things to continue as they are. You are comfortable, you are well fed, you are well housed, things are going the way you want them to go. You actually then tend to prefer the status quo. You don't want to change things, or if they do change, you want them to change very slowly in a logical evolutionary pattern. If you are not a part of the establishment, the in-group, if you're a part of the out-group, then you want things to change. You want them to be different. You want them to move in a much more rapid way and things to be overthrown. So therefore, you tend to be a liberal. At least you tend to think you are. Whereas the truth of the matter is, we as human beings just simply try to do the things which help us and avoid the things that hurt us. We tend to be for things that are going to make us feel better, enhance our well-being, our self-esteem, our wealth, our comfort, and we tend to be against things that in any way threaten any of that. And merely being against the things that hurt you and for the things that in some way help you doesn't make you a liberal or a conservative as such. That really, for the most part, is just so much words with no meaning. And of course, Jesus labeled it for exactly what it was, a great deal of utter hypocrisy. It has also been interesting to notice in the history of the world the number of revolutions that have taken place and how those revolutionaries who were, arch liberals, way out to the right, to the left, who wanted the overthrow and the change and social change, once the revolution is through, and once they become the new establishment, a neoconservatism sets in, and a whole different approach and a whole different attitude, and they become the conservatives. And a new group of people become the liberals. It's funny, but that's just the way those things work. If you've never read Orwell's Animal Farm, you really should do so. You may very well see in there some people that you recognize. Because, in fact, it takes you through a revolution, totally in an allegory. It takes you through a revolution and the change that took place in the revolutionaries as they go from the out-group to the in-group and the change. I think, again, you'll find it fascinating. I think you may be able to hang some names on the animals that you see characterized in this particular little book. It's not a long book, and it won't take you a great deal of time to read it. I think that if we suddenly found ourselves totally unified, basically, Paul tells us, I want you all to speak the same thing, be of the same mind, no divisions and no divisions among you. I really think that if all of a sudden, by some miracle, we all of a sudden found ourselves thinking the same thing, being right in the same part of the spectrum as far as liberal conservative is concerned, if we suddenly found ourselves that way, we would then begin to take the steps to create division between us. The reason I believe that is the case because I think human beings need division. At least they think they do. It's not what Christ wants for us. It's not what He thinks we should have, but it is the way we are. That we just cannot seem to stand unity. And I've marveled over it, and I've seen it illustrated so many times in people's lives, and I ask myself why. Is it because we simply just can't stand being a part of the herd? We just can't stand it if we are just like everybody else, and there is nobody around that we feel better than. Not very good grammar, but at least it says the point. There's nobody around to whom we feel superior. And if that is the case, then somehow in our minds, differences have got to emerge. differences between people, differences in ideologies, so that I have my thoughts and you have your thoughts and my thoughts are better than your thoughts. But of course, when all is said and done, God tells us that with all of our thinking, His ways are higher than ours and His thoughts are higher than we are. I want you to turn back in conclusion to Philippians, the 2nd chapter. Philippians chapter 2, in verse 1. Paul says, if there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if there is any comfort of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, if there are any feelings, bowels, mercies, fulfill you my joy that you be like-minded. It would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if we could overcome the natural human tendency to divide and to split and to want to see liberal conservative divisions in the church, that we could be like-minded and that we wouldn't be thinking in terms of this person being more liberal than I am or him being more conservative than I am. It would be wonderful if we could be like-minded. But the truth of the matter is we're always going to differ in the things that we do and the things that we feel. And if that's the case, why is Paul asking for something totally futile when he says be like-minded? I don't think so. He says be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vain glory. And right there, in that simple statement, is where the core of it lies. Vainglory, ego, self-importance. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem the other better than himself. Fascinating. He's calling upon us to go completely contrary to human nature, to go completely swim upstream, if you will, and to come face to face with a situation that's very difficult for us. And that is to break away from a situation where we look around at a spectrum of people, hang labels on everybody, and say to ourselves, I am in the middle of the road, and all these people are to the right or to the left of me. But rather to esteem everybody, he says, as better than yourself. It's a challenge which no one, as far as I know, offhand has been able to claim that they have really met. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, counted not equality with God a thing to be grasped at, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Now that is a call that Paul holds out. I think that sometimes you read that and you feel it's absolutely hopeless. There's no way to reach it. And I would say absolutely, as human beings, and as far as your own efforts and in the flesh, it is absolutely hopeless that you should ever come to that kind of a mind. But he's holding it out to us and making us realize that with the Spirit of God in us, and with the motivation of that Spirit beginning to dominate more and more in our lives, that we're not going to find ourselves in the position of trying to create these broad spectrums of political range of thought within the church and trying to identify ourselves in the spectrum and find our group and people we think with, but rather are going to begin to realize that we really individually don't know very much at all. And that I think I know, I think I understand, I try to serve God, and I trust Him to lead me day in and day out in my life, and began to turn loose of the opinionation or the opinionated attitudes that create this kind of liberal conservative thinking that exists in the church. Because you see, in order to be in that kind of thought, in order to live that kind of way and to have that kind of a grasp of things, you have got to be strongly opinionated. You've got to think, I know I am right. Well, brethren, I know that Jesus Christ is right. And I know that I am determined with everything in my being to follow Him. But one of the great lessons of the Bible, one of the great things that from all the way back in the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, clean through to the New Testament, that Paul tries to tell us, that Solomon tries to tell us, is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. And begin to look upon some of the arguments about liberal and conservative as the foolishness that they really are.
Turn the Page is a production of the Ronald L. Dart Evangelistic Association. To contact us or for more information, please visit our website, RLDEA.com.